want to issue a plea from the pulpit to the pew. There is a vicious cycle taking place today in churches, primarily Baptist churches, but it's not unique to our denomination. It's happening across our country. It is a vicious cycle that's dear to my heart, and it's the cycle of churches changing pastors every few years. It's a cycle where a church never keeps a pastor longer than just a few years, and pastors never stay in churches very long. They're constantly on the move. I can speak intelligently to this for two reasons. I've been a pastor now for 9 years. So I've been in the pew for 31 years. I've been in the pulpit and seen the reactions of a church toward their pastor. And I've been in the pew and seen the reactions of the church toward their pastor. Also, I've pastored 2 churches. The first one, I was there a year. The second one, where I am now at Lee Creek, I've been here 8+ years with no intentions or hopes to go anywhere else. So I can speak to this vicious cycle of churches cycling through preachers. As a matter of fact, when I came to Lee Creek, the church itself was only 13 years old, and I was the 6th pastor. That's a 2.5-year average. So let's address it. The average is less than 4 years for a preacher to stay at a church. That is the average. That's taking out the interims. It's less than 4 years. Most of the disagreements within the church, between the church and the pastor, is over leadership style. And the least amount of disagreements is over theology. And the reason there's such a disagreement over leadership style is because, quite honestly, the leadership is constantly changing and there is no stability. Now, I don't claim to have all the answers. And I know that every situation is different. I know there are reasons to leave in a short amount of time. I know there are times when God moves people. I know there are pastors that are innocent and churches that are wicked. And I know there are churches that are innocent and pastors that are wicked. And I'm not here to point fingers or to name names, but there is a pattern, a dangerous pattern, a weakening pattern that's causing not only weak churches, but it's bringing shame to the name of Christ by the way churches and pastors are interacting. And I know that by addressing this, I'm going to make a lot of people mad. That's not my intention. That's simply the repercussions of addressing something that needs to be dealt with. And to ignore it, or turn a blind eye to it, or act like it's not happening, is only to allow the problem to increase. So it's my prayer, it's my hope, it's my desire, it's my aim to address the preachers and the congregants of the churches. From the pulpit to the pew, I want to address everyone openly and honestly with a short message and some things to consider when the church and the pastor interact and how they interact. Peter addresses this in 1 Peter chapter 5, beginning in verse 2. After establishing himself as a fellow elder, he gives instruction to elders in verse 2. He says, "Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. Neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. For when the chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away." Verse 5, "Likewise ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace to the humble." There is clear instructions for how elders are to act. And there is clear instruction for how everyone in the church is to act. And it can all be summed up with that phrase in verse 5 where he says, "Yea, all of you be subject one to another." To be subject one to another means to love the other person more than yourself. That is a fundamental teaching of Christianity. To be willing to be in second place, to be willing to be in second chair, to be willing to be in the background in order for someone else to be in the forefront. The problem that I see, the mutual thing that I see between pastors and churches in this vicious cycle is an absence of love one for the other. The old preacher Richard Baxter said this: if they see you love them, you can say anything to them. I myself have been guilty of trying to say difficult things to a church before the church really knew the love that I had for them. You see, it takes time for a church to know that the pastor loves them. It takes time for a pastor to really understand that the church also loves him. Oftentimes, these relationships are not built in 18 months or 12 months. They're built over time. I venture to say you and your spouse knew each other longer than 12 months before you were married. It takes time to develop the relationships that are necessary to properly function as a pastor in a church. So, pastor, let me address you first. Pastor, do you love your congregation? Answer this question honestly. Do you love them? Now let me caution you against some ways you may think you love your congregation, but you don't. You may love the church and not the people. You may love the location. You may have a great school in the area for your kids. It may be close to your hometown. Hey, it may have a great place to hunt and a great place to fish. It may be near the beach. It may be convenient to you. But I didn't ask you if you love the location of your congregation. I said, do you love the congregation? You may love the way the congregation treats you. You may love the salary. You may have better benefits now than you've ever had in your life. You may make more money now than you've ever made in your life. I'm not asking you if you love the way they pay you. I'm asking you if you love them. You may say, well, I'm not in it for the location or the money. Then perhaps you could possibly just love the opportunities that your church affords. You love having a secretary. You love having a paid janitor. You love having an operating budget. You love being able to go on mission trips. You love the potential for growth in your area. You love the fact that your sanctuary looks nice and you have plenty of space. You love the office that you have. I didn't ask you if you loved the opportunities of the church. I'm asking you as a pastor, do you love those people with such a love that when they as individuals hurt, you hurt? That's the kind of love that's being talked about. That's the kind of submission that's being required here. That's the kind of love that we need to demonstrate to the church in order for them to see that we love them. Now, congregation, let me ask you, you're not a pastor. Let me ask you, do you love your pastor? Let me give you some options here that you may mistake for loving your pastor. You may say, well, I love the position that he holds and I respect his office as our elder. I didn't ask you if you respected his office. I'm asking you if you love him as a person. Do you love him? Because if you do not love him and you just respect his position, you will gladly get someone else in that position and return your respect to them. And you can replace him very easily if you do not have a love for him. You may say, well, I love his leadership style. He's laid back and relaxed and lets the deacons run everything. Or he's not pushy. I didn't ask you if you loved his leadership style. I'm asking, do you love the man that is your pastor? You may say this, well, I like his sermons. He's very easygoing and simple and down to earth, and his sermons are short, and I can understand them. I didn't ask you if you loved his sermons. I'm asking you, do you love the person that is your pastor? You must develop a love for the person of your pastor if you're going to fully submit. And if he's going to fully love you, you must be willing to love him. Let's look at the example of the great shepherd, Jesus Christ. The supreme example to every Christian believer, and also especially to the pastor in this text. In John chapter 10, verse 11, Jesus says this, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. Do you realize, pastor, that you're going to be called to lay down your life for the church, to give your life for those in the congregation, not for the building, not for the location, not for the money, willingly to sacrifice yourself for the love of these dear people as Christ loved the sheep? Then he says in verse 12, but he that is a hireling and not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth, and the wolf catcheth them, and scattereth the sheep. Oh, how many times have preachers saw trouble and didn't want to deal with it and fled to a greener pasture? Countless times. Countless times. Jesus makes it clear in verse 13. The hireling fleeth, because he is an hireling, and careth not for the sheep. Doesn't mean that he doesn't want their general protection. He took the job and was hired to do that. But because he doesn't have a deep love for the individual sheep, he leaves when times get tough. And let's be honest, that happens often. But Jesus also speaks to the sheep in this text. In verse 14 he says, I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine. Jesus, yes, knows who his sheep are. But here's the other side of the coin. The sheep know who Jesus is. Doesn't mean they merely have the facts that Christ came, born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, died making atonement on the cross, and rose from the grave and is coming again. It doesn't mean that his sheep know the facts. It means that the sheep know him. And you, as members of a church, are under a pastor, an elder, one who is set to teach you and lead and guide and direct you in spiritual growth. It is a gift from God to the church for their betterment. And you should know them. You should know your pastor or pastors personally and have a love for them. I don't say that love happens the moment you shake hands with him when he's voted in or appointed as your new pastor. I mean, you should genuinely invest your life in him as he is genuinely investing his life in you. And that takes time. And let me tell you what else. It takes two. It takes two. The church and the pastor must have a mutual love for one another. If the pastor loves the church and the church does not love the pastor, it will not work. Eventually it will fall apart. If the pastor doesn't love the church but the church loves him, it will eventually fall apart. But you're not responsible for what the pastor does. And pastors, you're not responsible for what the congregations do. You're responsible for your part. So if you're in the pew, you have a responsibility to love and humbly submit yourself to the pastor. You say, but Brother Harold, he's mean, he's arrogant, he's this. That's not your responsibility. God has no problem moving people out of the way. Pastor, it's your job to love the people in your church. Oh, but you don't understand the church I pastor. I don't pastor a church of loving people like yours. Listen. Jesus Christ didn't love the sheep because the sheep loved him. He loved the sheep because he was the shepherd. That's your responsibility. Why this is so important to me and why this is such a burden of my heart is because the world is looking at the church, and here's what they're seeing. A group of people who cannot find someone to be their pastor. They go to their neighbor. You need to come hear our new preacher. 18 months later, yeah, that guy was a sorry loser and he left and he did all of this. What is that telling your neighbor? You see, it's vital that the congregation and the pastor love one another. It's vital because in John 13, verse 35, Jesus makes this statement. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another. It doesn't mean that you love the people in your Sunday school class. It doesn't mean that you love your mom and dad and your own kids. It means that you love other Christians. And the pastor and the congregation are both Christians. Church, I implore you, love your pastor. Continue loving your pastor, even if he's offending you. Love him. Pray for him. If he is out of the will of God, God will remove him. Pastor, love your congregation. Even if they're disobedient and unruly and sinful and arrogant and unthankful and abusive, you love them anyway. Why? For the glory of God, so that all the world will know that you are a disciple of Jesus Christ. I say all of this, not with the hopes that it makes you mad, not with the hopes that you turn me off and say, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I say all this for one simple goal: that churches and pastors will function like churches are to function. That God will be glorified, that a lost world would see a church that functions as a church, that the glory that God the Father is worthy of would be demonstrated in the lives of His people. Preacher, if you're in a difficult situation, stay. Stay. Congregation, if you're in a difficult situation, pray and stay together and stay committed and don't leave. Allow these things to be fixed by the hands of God, who's able to break the hearts of sinful men and change conditions. It's not always the best option to run to the next place. We need some unity and some commitment in churches. I pray that this vicious cycle that has crept up in the last 50 or 60 years in American churches would soon come to an end, and the world would see the glory of the church the way it was designed, submitting one to another. May God help that happen.